Okay, so here we are in my kitchen for this next installment of Leather and Spice. In just a few minutes, I will be joined by a friend of mine who is a therapist, and we're going to have a conversation. We'll see where it actually leads, but the conversation is going to be centered around psychology, kink, BDSM, kind of understanding the intersection of these different domains. And in the meantime, I have a bunch of vegetables that have been sitting in my kitchen. And so I'm going to be basically processing them and cutting them up and going to basically roast them. I have some rice that I've already made, and I figured this is something nice to do. I always find myself when I'm like on the phone with a friend that I'm always doing something, whether it's cleaning my house or cooking, and I find that I am the happiest when I'm doing that. So I hope that that doesn't bother you if I'm doing multiple things, having conversations and cutting up vegetables, but it's what keeps me sane. So I'm gonna check really quickly just to see. Okay, so just a few minutes, it should be on. And if you happen to have any questions, feel free to put it in the comment section. Sometimes it goes really quickly and I don't see it. But if I happen to see it, I'll address it if I can. I hope you all are having a good Thursday so far. This week has kind of just evaporated for me. And that's why I'm kind of glad to be in my kitchen and help me focus in on some meditative time. So I have at the moment some potatoes that I am cutting up, and I cut up some celery, and these are going to go in a dish, and I'm going to just bake it 30 or 40 minutes, we'll see. Just going to see if a friend has joined. Not yet. Let's see. I got a bunch of these cute little peppers at the farmer's market. So I have a whole bag of them. So I think I'm going to save some for a salad, and I'm going to roast some of them. I don't know about you guys, but what I do with my cooking is I have several days, usually on the weekends, where I cook a lot. Like I'll cook for 3 or 4 days. So I always have food in the refrigerator so that when I don't feel like cooking, um, I can easily just reheat that up. But that means that every few days, I try to do some sort of big prep. So that's my goal today, is just to kind of process these vegetables that I have and then I have some roasted vegetables that will be easy to dress up in no time. I hope you find it entertaining to watch me cut my potatoes like this. Okay, let's see what's going on. Hey there. You should be able to join me. Just trying to make it so that you can do that. So Dr. C, I think that you need to request to be on the live with me. Keep saying that you're unable to join. I don't know what that's about. Yeah, I think you need to do it on your phone. I don't think you can go live with me on your computer. I think you need to do it on your phone. Okay. So we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, but Dr. C will be joining us in just a few moments. I think that he is um, just about to join on his phone, and hopefully the problem will be solved in just a few moments. But in the meantime, I am going to continue chopping my vegetables and getting that underway. got some carrots that need to be roasted, so I'm gonna cut these up as well. I'm just gonna make a medley. Whenever I have some, random vegetables, this is the thing that I end up doing is I always just cut them up. I roast them, um, depending on the vegetable, but usually around like 30 to 40 minutes. Add some spices, and then I have that which I can pair with usually rice or whatever whole grain I want to use. And yeah, it's a very easy meal to just have as a backup. And it's likely to last me for a few days. And then, if I make something like chicken or fish, then it's easy to, pair the vegetable with that. So, a little tip, that's not something that you're doing. I find that it really works for me. Let's see what is going on. I don't peel my carrots. I know some people like to peel it. I think that you can just wash it and that's good enough. I do think that there's some good vitamins that are in the skin, and I am try to be uh, I'm like one of the laziest cooks you'll probably meet, and so I try to skip all the unnecessary steps. And I feel like peeling um, carrots, especially if I'm gonna roast them, it's not that doesn't really make sense for me. But if I was to use them, let's say in a carrot cake, then perhaps I would peel it. So it really depends on what I would do there. So I am preparing at the moment just some vegetables that I'm going to roast up in my oven. Hey, are you all set now?
I think so.
Okay,
I've never done
great.
this before, and I can
So
barely see myself. I just feel like I'm very let me lower this camera.
yeah, I'm having to adjust my camera at the moment as well.
Oh God, my forehead really should not be in that close. Oh, let's see. I look like a normal human now, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're good.
All right. Oh, and good. I actually charged my phone, so this won't die while I'm
Yeah.
like talking to you.
Well, thank you for joining us. And thank you for sorting through the technical difficulty. So, you know, um, tell let people know like who you are, how you
Uh,
want to be called, and so forth, and whatever.
oh my gosh. Um, in an ideal world, I would have had like a very like chill afternoon where I like prepared a lot of things. But of course, given the work I do, which I'll explain in a minute, it was a hectic afternoon. So I'm just like barreling into this meeting from like meetings with
Sure.
patients. Um, but what I'll say in introducing myself is I'm Dr. C. I am a licensed psychologist in the United States. And I work with clients from a whole host of backgrounds, but my area of great passion is working with the queer community, especially gay men, and in particular, men who identify as part of the broader kink community is something I care deeply about. And I think that summarizes me very broadly. I do have a day job working with an academic medical center, but in order for my own privacy and for the privacy of any patients connecting with me, I'm going to keep that pretty quiet. But
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's who I am in a nutshell. And as I said, I didn't prepare that much,
It-
so I'm really
it-
waiting for you to take the lead in terms of what you want me to talk
yeah.
about and what I can possibly share today.
Well, um, I'll be completely honest in that I have had a similar busy week, and so I have not prepared that much. And so we are going to just have a true conversation and see where we land. Um,
Totally fine.
Now, I figure it would be great to start off with some background about like your leather journey and like your leather identity and like how did you first identify yourself or discover leather and then start identifying yourself within that subculture? Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that journey that you've been on?
The journey. Well, it's in progress, but I
Yeah,
think it's in progress for many of us.
yes, yes.
I think it's really hard to identify like a trigger point or a beginning point for anybody like in a community like this one. And for me, at least, it's difficult to say like this is the origin, you know, like this is where the road begins.
Right.
I do think for myself, it started when I was probably in middle school.
Mm.
I actually, it's funny you asked this question. I'm having like a flashback memory to be like, oh, what I remember finding kind of attractive. Did you ever watch the really corny show? I don't know, you're like around my age. So like it was on like the WB with Seventh Heaven. Did you ever see that show?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Yeah, I had to endure that show actually as a kid because my mom thought it was really wholesome and she liked it. And I was like,
Yeah,
this
my
is
mom too.
really
Yeah, I
corny.
was kind of forced to watch it at times. So,
But I
yeah.
recall being fairly young. I guess it was in like sixth, seventh grade, and their son in that show, Simon, wears like a really great leather jacket. And I remember like every time it would come on and he would wear it, I was like, "Oh, I'll keep watching the show with you, Mom." Um, and it's one of those things that like implants itself in your brain. And then I
Yes.
remember I would see guys that kind of looked like him or wearing the same kind of jacket type and saying like, "Oh, like I'll double take that in the streets." And when you're like in seventh grade, you don't know what that necessarily means because other people are coming out by saying like, "I like girls," especially when they're guys, and you're like,
Yes.
"Oh, maybe I just want to be like that person," right?
Mm-hmm.
But that must be what that is. And so, I always joke that the language for coming out as gay preceded very long in advance the language for coming out in terms of being associated with anything kink.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really describes my own journey. So like the coming out process as gay like had to take precedence, especially like in high school and college. And then it really wasn't until I was like out of college that I was able to really understand what it was that was triggering my intense sexual reactions and my interests, and realizing it's this deeper community within like a sub community within the queer gay community. It's like,
Yes.
oh, so it's like journeying to what you think is the bottom of, not the barrel, that sounds like a negative connotation, but going to like the bottom of what you think is there, and also there's a trap door and you're like, whoa, there's a, pun intended, there's a dungeon down here, and going even deeper and saying like, wow, like there's this whole element of what describes my sexuality that isn't captured by,
Yeah.
the movement that I think got really popular like when I was in college of like, gay marriage and like, let's all just think gays are just like all of us, when in fact like, kink is probably by nature not central. It's on the margins by its very nature almost.
Mm.
And to mainstream that would almost be a disservice to the community. So,
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that story. I feel like when you were talking about your experience with Seventh Heaven, a memory of mine came up of like I remember as like, you know, being a toddler, like 3 years old, 4 years old, I was obsessed with He-Man.
oh
Did you ever
yeah,
watch He-Man?
I didn't watch, but I know it. Yeah.
Okay, so I watch He-Man like every day, and then Thundercats. And for people that don't know, these are cartoons that really focus on like really super muscular men that are probably like on steroids, that they're cartoons, but like really built muscular men in very little clothing. And yeah, I mean, like I think as a kid, like that's what I was exposed to, and as an adult, that's what I watch. So I think that there's some like, connection there, that I can't help but find humorous.
Definitely. And it's so interesting how these things pop up in childhood and they sort of like plant these long-term seeds in your life that you never forget, even when you're, much older as an adult. It's like you'll never forget where that came from.
Right, right. And going to your the comment that you made about essentially like your gayness wasn't explaining all the variants in, your feelings and so forth, right?
Mhm.
That there's other like possible predictor variables there. I I came through a similar track, and I feel like I still go through these tracks of like, I feel like I understand myself. Like I feel like, you know, as a teenager, I thought, oh, the only thing that made me different was the gay aspect,
Yeah.
and that was before I realized like kink. But I early on, like was engaged in very kinky behavior that
Hmm.
most gay men that I knew were not engaging in that behavior when they were 18, 19, and so on. And um, for me, that was always a point of curiosity. Like that's something I needed. I needed that kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but this kind of like darker edge that I was able to connect with myself more than I felt like
Hmm.
most of the time where I went to mainstream gay places, I often felt, and I still sometimes feel like a bit of sadness because I feel like I don't connect with mainstream culture. I find myself overwhelmed by the sounds and like it's just too much, like it's overwhelmed, whereas
Hmm.
I feel like in gay leather culture my senses are not in overload, they are um everything's complemented well. Like I don't find myself like if I go to the Eagle versus if I go to like a really loud place that is blasting music and there's a lot of dancing, like you get I get two different experiences.
Yeah. Not to
So
therapize you, but that sounds really isolating to like go to a queer space
sh-
and feel,
sure,
overwhelmed. It could feel
and
that way.
and it has been really welcoming for me over the years. Like I would say in my mid 20s was when I first started going to leather
Okay.
spaces and realizing the difference of how I felt in those spaces versus like traditional mainstream spaces.
Yeah.
And then realizing that there's actually like a leather culture and understanding uh, basically the expansiveness of how sex can be so creative and so
Mm.
playful in the
Yeah.
leather space. Whereas I feel like in mainstream space, that's not necessarily the context it's put in. Um, yeah.
You're making me think about like in many ways in which heteronormativity kind of bridges into queer culture, even if we don't mean for it to.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny actually. It's this, it's actually it's November 2nd, so it's already like this time of year where the holidays come up, and there's those horrible Hallmark movies that go on. Like
Yes.
there's some channel that like I'll put on the TV, and it's just like endlessly. But that's a place where, like, for example, like it was a big deal. I think it was either last year or 2 years ago, where like the guy from Mean Girls like did the first like gay
Mm.
Hallmark movie,
Yeah. Yeah.
and on the one hand, it was kind of heartwarming. Like I may be part of this community, but I do love the heartwarming shit from the holidays. Like, I'm not gonna lie. And I remember like hearing from like my family, like, don't you love that? Isn't that so great? And on the one hand, I'm like, okay. But it also is like an example of like the way in which like heteronormativity kind of spreads into like gay culture, and there's a need, it feels, to adapt into that broader narrative, which, you know, ultimately can be reductive into like get married and
Right.
conform to capitalism and have baby now. And you can get surrogates because you're gay, but like have baby, and get the dog and the picket fence and all that stuff. And where was I going with all of this? Something about
So like
maybe,
in the leather
yeah.
community, let's contrast that with the leather community. Is that where you're going?
Well, yeah, and also like if we contrast it, like sex becomes like this like act of creativity, I think, is you're getting
Mm.
at, rather than just sort of
Yes.
like this thing that happens that we don't question its role. And I love in kink and in this culture the centrality of pleasure and joy and fun and happiness in the way we experience sex. You
Yes.
know, I have a very distinct memory at a younger age, and I'm so glad I did this, of being with a partner, and they were terrified to engage in gay sex acts.
Sure.
And I said, look, let me just like level with you. Please don't do anything to impress me or do something that you think I like because you're nervous. Please, let's just have fun exploring our bodies together.
Yeah.
Because that's, if we're not having fun and loving this experience, we're wasting our time. Like,
right.
You're not gonna have fun, I'm not gonna have fun. And I'm so glad I said that, and that's been really like a mantra in my experience of sexuality. It's like, let's make sure we have fun in this experience. And I love the centrality to that in both the act of sex and the expression of that sexuality and the creativity around that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's so crucial. And I've been, you probably can add to this, but I've been like reflecting on how the AIDS crisis has like really impacted our community, because I feel like our generation, at least like I remember dating guys when I was 18, 19, so forth. There was a lot of worry about sex, and I felt like I dated guys that thought that like AIDS was just gonna pop out in the air. Like they didn't understand like consequences of like, well, no, like someone actually has to have the disease and have a viral load that they, they can pass on. But I felt like there was so much anxiety around sex, and I feel like a lot of people in my generation didn't have proper sex education to combat those anxieties, and so they just like went really intense. And I wonder now, in comparison to like Gen Z, where they basically have had access to PrEP during their sexual, the beginning years of their sexual life, like I want to say they probably have a healthier relationship with sex. But like, what's your take on like this?
I have like, there are two things. I don't know if I have any authority to say like my take, like this is what I think and that's it. But I do have two thoughts that came up. One was somewhere I read in some book that was like, there's a really negative stereotype or cultural narrative that came around in the gay community because of AIDS. And it goes something like this. In the 60s and the 70s, we became liberated, and then we got punished for being too sexually promiscuous with AIDS, even though that is totally a heteronormative religious propaganda narrative, but it's internalized. Yeah. Then the 90s, we kind of like were recovering, and then we said, no, let's refocus away from sex onto like normal things and good Christian moral things like gay marriage. And there was this narrative in the mid 2000s of like, we're being persecuted by like George W. Bush and all that stuff, because frankly we were, like, let's be honest, like that's ridiculous that was happening.
Yes.
But how did we go from 2005, like with the proposed amendment against gay marriage in the Constitution, to 2015, we have this like wonderful Supreme Court decision? Well, we're just like you, and we don't have to talk about sex. We can just like kiss and hold hands, and take me home to your mom, and she never has to ask about the things we do when the door closes. Which, that was one thing that came to my mind, like this grand cultural narrative that's really stayed with us till today, 2023. Right. And to your point about like generational divides, there's this weird way in which I actually feel like millennials, as gay millennials, were kind of like the transition generation between Gen X to Gen Z, because Gen X would have been, I think, and the boomers too, would have been very affected as gay in the gay community by AIDS and HIV. Yeah. And when I was a child, that still was with me, and it was so people that we could see and touch and communicate with who were suffering very seriously. And I do not mean to diminish. It's not like we were overreacting to the severity of the AIDS crisis and HIV. I knew some of these folks. My own mother like had a very dear friend die because of this illness, a gay man, and it stuck with her. And I remember coming out and her terror around what would happen to me, and that was very rooted in reality. It wasn't like you're overreacting. It was like, look, my best friend who used to go with me, who took her to the Phantom of the Opera in the 80s, he died. Like that was real. But where that transition, we're like now in our late 20s, early 30s, we see Gen Z, and they're like, yeah, that's something we read about in the textbooks, and that's just not really something that's lived for me. I have PrEP. And there are even a few cases, my understanding is that like HIV can actually be removed from, like there's a few cases where HIV is actually gone from the system. Yeah. That's so different from what was essentially a death sentence only, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago. Close to that.
Which like really, I feel like that really messed me up, and it's taken me so many years to like realize that. But
Yeah.
to basically, anytime I would be in a sexual act, I would be thinking about death, and I would be thinking about AIDS, right? And like how, and then you think about, well, before AIDS, like people didn't have this connotation, this connection, and how freeing that must have been. Like how nice not to have to worry about, an epidemic, for instance.
Mm.
Yeah. So I do think that there is some trauma there that is inherited, um, that makes Gen Z a little bit different, I want to say, because they haven't really lived in that world. And I find that they're a little bit more sexually active in some ways than people of my generation were on
I
average.
think they're definitely safer in the way they're
Mm,
sexually exploratory. Like, let's be
hmm.
fair, like there's so much psychological research. Like if you go to Google Scholar and you Google like risky behaviors gay men, it's like welcome to the encyclopedia of horror and death. And there's just so much research and frankly grant funding out there in the field to endlessly study substance use and like unprotected sex and men who have sex with men, which is really this like label that was created because men would be like, well, no, I'm not gay, but I have sex with other guys. So they were like,
Right.
okay, but that's because of stigma around the identity. And there's such a prevalence in the community of like really, really risky sexual behaviors. And what I find so joyous about Gen Z sometimes is the openness with which sex is discussed and explored. Like, I love there's this show on Netflix, Sex
Yeah.
Education. Have you seen it?
Yeah. It's great.
It's so good
Yeah.
because like it is so wonderful at blending the seriousness that comes with sex. There's like stories
Yes.
of there's like that instance where she gets that one girl gets masturbated on the bus, and it's very
Right.
serious. But there's a whimsy to the show too, and the sort of the joyousness and the weirdness of sex, and sort of like
Yes.
that. Ultimately, like the show, I watch it, and sometimes I'm like, this doesn't feel like it should be like rated R or something. It feels PG-13 to me, especially because all the characters are like high schoolers, and yet
Right.
the content when I was in middle school, you would never ever talk about those things, except maybe in
Totally.
health class if you were in a liberal state, right? Not
Totally.
even
Yeah.
conservative state, you're not even gonna get
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. And so I feel like in some ways, and maybe that's just because that's made in the UK, like they've come a long way about being able to talk about sex
Mhm.
in a very welcoming and inclusive way
Yeah.
that I think America can only strive for at the moment. Because I don't know of any American production that's as inclusive as
Well,
that show
I was gonna think the
is.
only thing that came to my mind, and I actually haven't watched it, so somebody on this might correct me, Euphoria, but that's just
Oh,
like bonkers, is what I understand.
I have not watched that, and I've only seen clips, and I'm like, it, it just doesn't seem like it just seems really intense. Like the
Yes.
White Lotus for teenagers is what it seems to me.
Well, now I have to watch it though because I love White Lotus. So you don't get any secret. Yeah, but I take your point about these generational divides and the role of sex and really sex positivity, if we call it that,
Yeah.
culture now. Yeah.
So I think, where do I want to go with that?
Go wherever you want.
I I want to change the subject, and I want to somehow get back to where a conversation we had during the summer, where you had some like interesting takes or comments about the intersection of like or the compromise of the roles between being a psychologist and being like a master or like a dom.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm pulling up our email exchange, by the way, because I'm remembering vague themes that you're talking about. Um, so let me pull this up so I can recall.
and I don't know if there's anything in the email exchange that we had, but I was wondering if you had any more thoughts on that, or where you wanted to go with that.
I'm looking at, okay. This is the comment I wrote in my notes, because I actually do take notes sometimes, and I'm like on top of things, which doesn't feel that way. All I wrote down was this line: the parallel process of therapy and play, and that meaning like the kink. I think.
Yeah. So like what's popping up for me when you said that is, there have been times, and I don't know if we want to go in this deep, but there have been times where like I feel like when I'm in play, I've been given a lot of responsibility. I've been given a lot of a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I feel as though I need to respect that responsibility and not abuse that responsibility, because I feel like there's been times in my life where people in power abused their power, and I recognize the power I've been given, and there's kind of this like moment in play where like I'll flash back to a part of my life where someone like abused their power, and I'm like, but I'm not going to do that. Like I am going to, respect this, these boundaries. These are the boundaries in which I'm operating under. And I feel like that is always a reminder of like the type of person I hope to be and where I'm aiming towards.
Yeah. Broadly, you're talking just in your life.
Very broadly, yes.
Yeah.
Like if we're gonna talk about like keywords, like when someone calls me daddy, like that's not something I would ever actually say to my father, right? Like my father was a pretty like absent person in my life. Like and I feel so grateful when people see me in that role, and when I've been able to verbalize other men and call them daddy, and I see them in that more father role, and to be well received, because there's this corrective nature that I think can happen during play that kind of it speaks to your inner child, if we're going to use that language, and says like, it's okay, like things are fine.
Well, a big part of what you're talking, not a big part, yes, a big part, what am I saying? Something that we haven't named, I think, outright, but I think is important to talk about in any sort of intense kink play, is we talk about aftercare. I mean, there is a way, I think, so often in what our fantasies are, our kink expectations are, in which it's a bit cliched, and I don't love cliches, but like it's connected to the things that we struggled with at a young age, and those relationships that we're reenacting in these role plays or in these dynamics. And you get to go and play to a space where you are maybe treated poorly, quote unquote, or maybe you are physically hit consenting, and yet in a good play, in really high quality sexual activity and experiences, there is aftercare.
Yes.
And the person that you did that with talks to you afterwards, and they care for you, and they provide sort of a relief from those high emotions. I'm sure there are folks listening to this, or you, or I could think of times where like that didn't happen, and it was just a bad experience. I actually think of like as Dan Savage says, leave the other person better than you found them. That's critical.
Totally.
If you don't have that, it's going back to what I was saying, earlier, it's not joyous, it's not fun. It's just, oh, that was painful and not in a good way. You don't want
Do you feel like the play that one can experience in BDSM, I don't want to say this, can be just as restorative or more restorative than what can result in like traditional talk therapy for some people?
Ooh, big question.
I know.
I could never put anything about my profession, because we got to keep people coming in the door, okay? So like, let's maybe be clear. And I'm by no means going to open up an alternative practice that does all this, because that's no. I think it is therapeutic. I think for many people it is, and it goes back to the creativity around sex, right? Like, do we think of sex as productivity? Somebody in this chat I saw sex as productivity, and I don't know who it was, but thumbs up to that line. Or do we think of it as an experience of pleasure and growth and change and joy? And in that sense, that is therapeutic. And I think that it can help us become people who are happier and just more satisfied with our lives. I mean, in that sense, yes, it is therapeutic. I don't know if it would ever like, not that this is a thing I subscribe to, but like resolve issues.
Sure.
You know, I think,
Sure.
you know, I can have my kinks and you can have yours, and I still need to go to therapy to be like, why didn't my father hug me enough when I was 5 years old? And whatever. I'm being a little stereotyping here, like, but I've heard those stories, and it's true.
Right.
Like, I think we do need to verbalize and understand what we go through, because actually, I think that process is recursive, to get frank.
Yes.
You know, you're going to probably have better sex when you can understand the dynamics at play and you can verbalize them rather than just like act solely intuitively, I think.
Right. And I definitely feel like kink is informed by your past experience. And so if there are things that had happened to you as a child, like, you know, it's good to recognize that that's playing a role, because I think a lot of guys may not recognize that. And I think once you recognize it, then you have the power of like how you want to engage with that.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I think that can open up a really crucial door.
Oh wow, that's a really like your reference to the idea of power actually and empowerment, I think, is really striking to me. And I don't know if I actually made that connection, but I agree with it. I think very, very much. Like it is empowering, because the alternative, I think, to what you're talking about, and I feel like we all know men like this. There's very emotionally distant sexual experiences and cold sexual interactions that are just very mechanistic. You know, just like very like machinery, like just like very like functionality. Like, I'm going to like get off with you. And, you know, like the stereotype of the grinder hookup is like, no, get out.
Right.
And look, like sometimes people do that, and that's that, but like the coldness and the way in which it's not being processed. So like, well, why did we do all those elaborate things? We need to understand that.
Right.
Why did we need to not just like have sex, but like have gear, or have like toys, have like a setup here? Like, what drove that? And if we don't interrogate that, it's not going to be fulfilling in my view.
Yeah. And I feel like that is, in my take, I feel like I often see that behavior more in like mainstream gay culture rather than in leather culture, because I feel like leather culture is a little bit more informed psychologically about
I think you're right.
these things. And I think that's why I tend to seek out other people in the leather community when I play, because I feel like they're more intelligent about like, what are the things that they are into, what are their boundaries, and so forth. And I mean, I frankly don't believe it when I'm chatting with some guy who's in his early 20s and I ask him, you know, so what are your boundaries, what are you into, right? And he's like, I'm into anything. And I'm like, I don't believe that. So then I'll be like, okay, like, are you into being fisted? No. Okay, then you're not into anything. Like, you got to tell me where your lines are. And I think a lot of people don't realize that everyone has different things that intrigue them or motivate them, you know?
And there's the interrogating of what you're interested in, but also think about what like could possibly motivate someone to just be like, I'm into anything. Like, obviously, like, there's being young and being like, I just want to like have an experience. But also it's posturing, and it's like not wanting to admit the things that we do have boundaries over. And you know, that's a really good point that you make about like general, broad, mainstream queer culture. I feel like is more of that coldness. I have found most people I encounter in the queer kink community are not cold. I mean, rather, or if they are, frankly, they're probably like not so involved in the community, and they're a bit more distant looking in, which is a hard place to be in. I'm not saying that that's like to hell with them. I'm saying that's really difficult. But the people in the community rather are artistic, they're intellectuals, they're nerds. So many nerds, by the way. Like, and, I was into Lord of the Rings as a kid, and it's like, oh, probably where a lot of those other Lord of the Rings nerds were also into this stuff too.
Right.
And like the interest in all these different things. And we are people that like I think tend to be very friendly, like and really good at navigating the porousness of boundaries around like friendship, sex,
Yeah.
and just like play, right? Like it's so like I feel like I don't hear as much. That's not non-existent, but I don't hear as much jealousy and envy within the queer kink community. There's a collaborativeness. There's a kind of like understanding the porous nature of relationships, and that you may want to have a play experience with somebody, and then that was fine, and you don't need to do that again, but you can go out for drinks and like hang out, and and I think that's also like a positive element of gay culture too. Like I think this is just such a one-up on heteronormative culture.
I cannot agree more. And going back to a point that you made a little bit ago about this like heteronormativity creeping into gay culture, I feel like what we lose is that, when people subscribe to the heteronormativity, we're losing the freedom that we've been given as gay people to do whatever the F we want. And that is like incredible power that I feel like some people don't even recognize. That, if you have the gay card, it's giving you the ticket to live whatever life that you want.
I do think that I do think there are, I caution against language that we can do whatever the hell we want, because, in treatment with patients, like, look, boundaries can be crossed within relationships. There is jealousy. Like, it's not like this just does not happen.
Right.
But I do think we come to the table with no heteronormative, expectations, right? No expectations. Like,
that's what I mean.
Yeah, and I'm stealing this, by the way, to quote Dan Savage again from his most recent, I think, episode, where he talked about I can't remember the particulars of the story, but basically some gay guy they write in his show like, Dear Dan, and the story was that like a guy was dating the guy, he had hooked up with a guy, and then he hooked up with that guy's roommate, and then like kind of actually developed a relationship with the second person. Like it was like a more serious relationship. He was like, well, am I breaking the bro code, right? And Dan Savage went on this like long rant in the episode about like, there is no effing bro code. Like that's the joy of gay weddings. Like everybody has probably had sex with the grooms, like when you go, because like people understand like it's, versus like a straight wedding where it's like, oh, you invited your ex-boyfriend? Oh, did you have an affair at the wedding? It's like, whoa, we're like in two different worlds here. And I think that's just something that I think that is really wonderful that we can do. We go in with those lack of expectations and the willingness to openly negotiate and like talk bluntly about like, what do you like? What are you into? What do you expect from our interaction?
Yes. And I mean, it's so funny that on, any of the apps that you go on, I'm way more willing to give explicit information about the things I'm into, the things I want done to me. I don't want to talk about my job. I don't want to even say what my name is, right? I don't want to talk about those parts of who I am. I'm going to be talking about these really intimate parts. And I find that that's really interesting in the gay world, that that's like normalized. I mean, like I find that really efficient, and at least that's how I use the apps myself. But yeah.
But even the apps, like, and going back to like the no expectations thing, it's funny, when I was younger, you'd always see like, I'm just here to make friends. People were like, that's bullshit. I think that was a bigger thing to say like 10 years ago. The thing is now, actually, I have seen it and engaged in like it personally. Like, no, I've actually like made a friend through an app, and I don't want it to be anything that's like a side play partner or something. It's more like, no, we're in a similar community. We've used this app to connect. You're interesting. I don't think this is going to go anywhere sexually, and that's fine. Yeah. Again, I love the creativity that we bring as a community to these kinds of things. Something just beeped in your background.
It did. My oven, I set the temperature, so it got up to the temperature.
Ooh, so we've risen the temperature in this room? Is that what we're saying?
We are.
Made it really hot? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah. You know, as an aside, and you can go whatever you want, but I just had to mention this. When we talked over the summer, you would ask a lot of questions about, like, in psychology, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual and, like, kinks. And I am not the expert on that, so I actually have it on the table next to me in case you were to be like, tell me about XYZ. I'll be like, well, and let me tell you. So just want to let you know,
Well,
like, this thing is,
I mean, we could even go down that.
Right now.
We can go down that route because
we don't have to. I just was letting you know it's sitting there.
I mean, my opinion of the DSM maybe is a little bit controversial because I find that most people that are writing the DSM are probably not kink informed. They're probably not even gay. Like, I have this image of, like, just a bunch of white straight married men, and it's their point of view on the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a hard time, like, the more and more I kind of think about it, I have a hard time with a lot of these things that are called disorders. And I feel
Right.
like it should only be a disorder if it's, like, really disrupting the person's life. But sometimes I feel like that label can really do more harm than just being like, okay, so these are the things, these are the actions or behaviors
Mm-hmm.
that you might need to be more conscious of, or to adapt, or things like that, or to know what triggers you versus,
Yeah.
other things. I don't know, like, where are your thoughts on the DSM and the pathologization of humans in
Oh
general?
God. Why don't I just take you through my entire doctoral training? It'll take you about 6 years. Do you have the time? I don't know where to begin, so I'm going to try to do this in an organized way because you've opened up like 18 different like chests of just like stuff to go through, and so I'm going to try to like cherry pick the big ones. One, the DSM broadly, before we get into the details of like all the paraphilic disorders as they call them. It is problematic. And it is problematic, I believe, my belief is that at its core, what's problematic about it is that it is categorical, right? It basically categorizes symptoms into clusters and says, if you have clusters A, B, C, D, or like, it's really like, if you have 5 of these 7, cha-ching, you hit this thing.
Right.
Okay. It's not dimensional.
Right.
And here's what I mean by that. This gets a little bit into the work I do outside of the queer community and also intersecting with it. I've done a lot of work with people with psychosis, which is a symptom, and schizophrenia. So let's stick with the word schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is something that, pull it up in this book somewhere. I don't even need to because I know too much about it. Schizophrenia, you only need like a few symptoms to be checked off before you hit the diagnosis, like you have it. You have to have these symptoms for like about 6 months or more, right? Okay. And I had a supervisor who very thoughtfully said to me, you are going to see 5 people in a room and they all have the label schizophrenia and they're all going to have different symptoms, right? Because we put so many symptoms in the bucket of schizophrenia, as we call it, and you need very few to get the label. It's like 1, 2, 3, but if there's like 7, 8, 9, 10 symptoms I can pick from, I don't know math very well, permutations, combinations, you can get like all these different schizophrenias, right? You have somebody who stares blankly at the wall, you have someone who hears voices, you have somebody who believes that the government is out to get them, you have somebody who is, I don't know, really hyper-religious, right? So categorically, it doesn't make sense. It's not dimensional, right? We should really be understanding people's experiences by like understanding, well, what are you experiencing symptom-wise? What's the problem that's leading you to this hospital, to my office, or whatever? And, we really want to understand it from a medical model, which is even broader. How do we reduce those symptoms rather than just saying like cluster this, and this makes you this, cluster this, and that, because everything is so transdiagnostic, right? You have elements of schizophrenia that show up in OCD, which show up in autism, which show up in anxiety disorders, and like you can almost like go through the circle of fifths, that's a musical reference, and come back to the original disorder by chaining through all the different diagnoses and symptoms that are part of those diagnoses. So that's the DSM. I have problems with it. I don't love using it, but I do need to use it for billing and insurance. That's why I use it, because the government and the company that pays me says, you must do this. I'm like, fine. Now, the paraphilic disorders. You raised a point about like, what do they describe our, paraphilic disorders as? And there's actually something that they did, and I don't know when they did it. I actually don't know the history well enough. But at least in the last iteration of the DSM, there is very distinct language for every paraphilic disorder that says something to the effect of, it has to be just causing you distress or impeding you living your life. I'm going to try to find it. That's wrong. That's wrong. That's not it.
And can you
So
give
here we are
some examples of these disorders, like just so that we have the
okay. Literally, this is one called fetish disorder, fetishistic disorder, right? Very broad. But here we go. This is the critical line that they added, and I actually think this is important. The fantasy sexual urges or behaviors cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And there's another one, I couldn't find it. I think it's voyeuristic disorder, where it's like the person who you're watching is not consenting to this, right, in any way, shape, or form. Which I'll admit,
sure,
that opens the door to, so is it okay? Like, frankly, like if somebody came in and said, like, I am look, obviously, like for someone who's like, I have a fetish for leather, I'm gonna be like, and welcome to the club. But like if somebody come in distress and say like, I really like watching people and they don't know that I'm watching them, then it's a question of like, well, where's the consent there, right? What are you doing when you watch them? What are they doing while you watch them? Can, I'm not gonna really go in there and try to like uncouple those connections, but rather is there a way to express this side of yourself in a way that is healthy? There are plenty of people who engage in that in a consenting way. Right. And that's fine. But can you see a pathway to that? Or are you coming into this office and you're just in distress by the sheer fact, right? Is it like a person raised in a religious household who comes in saying like, well, I'm gay, you got to change that. Right. It's like, well, no, we're not going to do that. Maybe we can have a different relationship with this quality of your life, or this element of who you are. Yeah. I know I went on a long rant there, so you can hit the brakes and please tell me where you want to like go back or bounce around, please.
I'm just thinking.
You a lot.
Yeah, you did. It was very fascinating, so I enjoy hearing that all. Where do I want to go with that?
My therapist line is, this is your time.
I don't know, is something coming to your mind? Like my mind is like a little...
I just bombed it out a lot of my mind.
You did.
I guess like...
So, okay, let's talk about this, okay? Let's say that someone wanted, someone in the kink community wanted to like access therapy. I think it's important for a person to be able to show all sides of themselves in therapy. Is there something that you think a patient or client, however you call it, should be looking for to make sure that the person would be kink sensitive?
That's a hard question to answer because I don't know really of any major resources that like direct you to like kinkaffirmingtherapist.com. Wouldn't that be great? Yeah. Idea for a future idea. Talk to some of my friends. I have one friend.
You can do it.
I'm sure you know I can do it. So I don't have like a solid like this is where you go. And obviously I think I said like I'll provide some resources at the end, just like here's some websites that you might be able to go to. I do think it's hard because I think I will say this. I trained pretty recently. I finished my PhD only within the last 2 years. So I have pretty up-to-date clinical training, right? It's not like I trained in the 1990s or the 80s and it's like, in my day, the Freudian analytical, I don't even know what to answer with all that because I don't think it's true. Right. Sorry for the old supervisors I had. I would say like in my modern training, these particular like sets of disorders that I was just sort of reading off in the book and would just not be emphasized. Frankly, my lack of knowledge around this, it's not like I went to the bad program that didn't teach me those. You would probably be you would be hard pressed to find a program that at all emphasizes those. So that's one thing. You probably wouldn't come at it with a clinical diagnosis problem where the person would be like, you have a disorder. Okay. I do think you would be coming at it from just a simple lack of knowledge by the
Mm.
provider, right? And stereotypes that exist about sadism, masochism, etc., that have been perpetuated through like culture and things like that.
Right.
I do think, and it is reductive, and I worry about always being reductive, but like sometimes seeking out members who self-identify as members of a community really can at least help it feel like you are safe to talk about these things with the therapist. And frankly, what you can do when you're consulting, any good therapist should consult with you, right? They do that free 15, 20, 30-minute phone call that's just like, are we a good fit? It might be a really brave thing to do, but like ask them directly, like, look, this is a part of who I am.
Mm.
And we talk about this. Are you going to be able to handle this?
Yeah.
I think we all know when somebody is either telling us the truth or bullshitting us if they say yes.
Yes.
At least I like to think my bullshit meter or radar is usually pretty attuned.
Mm.
And, you know, I myself have been in therapy and talked about such things. And, you know, I had a white woman therapist who I really did adore. Like, I'm not knocking her. She was one of the most amazing people. But when we ended, near the end of our time together, I did say, like, I couldn't talk about some of these things, really. I kind of touched on these elements near the end. And
Yeah.
she said regularly, I remember she would remind me, like, I'm affirming of all queerness. And I was like, at some point, your lack of lived experience, you know, I knew she had a husband, I knew she had a kid and lived in the
Right.
suburbs of the city I was living in at the time. And I was like, look, like, I appreciate your allyship and I believe in that allyship. I'm not here to say like she was lying. But I think that I ended up transitioning therapists at that time to somebody who was closer to the community, if not a part
Mm.
of it. And honestly, and this is the tricky thing also, you don't always want to know like things about your
Sure.
therapist. It's not always healthy to know
Yeah.
everything. So, you know, with my own patients, I share it with very few that I'm even associated with any what I call subculture of the queer community. That was the word
Mm.
sometimes that I use, subculture.
Yeah.
And if they ask directly, I will tell them. But if they don't know what to do with that data, then, you know, I just sort of let it
Yeah.
lie there.
Do you see primarily, and you can decide not to answer this question, do you see primarily gay clients? Is that what you're focused on?
I mean, I sometimes joke that would be like, I was going to say the dream, but it's not the dream. What I do see is a lot of men, actually.
Okay.
I think that is because men tend to reach out to other men because, at least in the field of psychology, it's an 85 to 90% female field.
Yeah.
And probably of those women, the majority of them are white. And the majority of them are upper middle class. Which I know is a stereotype, and anybody listening who says, I'm not that, I know you are not. I'm not saying that everyone is, but the numbers don't lie. I know you do stats, so you know the numbers don't lie.
Yeah.
And they don't, you know, so men tend to seek out other men. And not only gay men, like it's gay men and it's straight men. And they tell me pretty vulnerable things pretty quickly, I will say. Like, I'm honored to listen to some of the things my men that I work with share with me. And I won't say what they share, but like some of the things they share, I just know they would never share that with a female therapist. They wouldn't share it even with a straight male therapist. I think even being gay to a straight male client. Remember I was talking about like breaking heteronormative expectations.
Yeah.
They love it. Like I'll say to them like, oh, like they'll talk about like, oh, I'm dating this woman and like I think this is what she expects to happen next, and I'll just be like, that doesn't have to happen. You can just be fuck buddies. And I remember having a male straight patient being like, is that allowed? And I was like, what do you think is an alternative? And he's like, well, I have to keep dating and then I'll get married if I do this long enough. Like, it was almost like, if I keep having sex long enough, we'll get glued to one another in a marriage. And I was like, no.
I mean, it doesn't have to be like that, but I think that a lot of people operate under that model that that's what's going to happen. And then I think I mean, that's why you had so many people getting married and then 50% getting divorced.
Right, because it's almost like you're on a train and then like the train just keeps going. You're like, I want to get off.
Yeah. And you have like, again, I I think it's a question about, or a practice of like having good boundaries, because I feel like if you can just be like, listen, this is all I want, like, you know, we don't need to go any further, but this is just what I'm looking for, you know. But I often feel with straight people especially, you know, I've sensed this kind of like, well, I need to get married, I need to have kids, and this like push that I don't know if it really comes from within. Like it's hard to know whether it's coming from within or
Right.
whether it's like the weight of society on them. And I frankly think that like Disney brainwashes kids into like heteronormativity, at least 90s and
Oh,
80s
those
Disney
90s movies were
movies.
very toxic. No,
Yes.
and I actually speak as somebody who loves those movies. They actually really did raise me. And in a totally side defense of Disney is in their like promotion, like heteronormativity, no, but like they did give a kid like me hope when I had a pretty unstable parent life. Like, they made me feel at least I could achieve that because Cinderella goes through a lot to get to where she is.
Yes.
She is abused. Anyway, that's an aside.
That's a separate story.
But
she's now into BDSM. But we didn't
like,
get that.
Oh,
movie,
tell me to clean everywhere. Yeah, you want me to clean your chimney?
Yeah. Yes. I don't know why someone hasn't made that movie, but that's part.
I mean, there's
two.
a guy who like takes a shoe all around town, and it's just like, which one of you is the right fit for my shoe? It's like, did you just want to see all those feet?
And then Beauty and the Beast. I mean, like that's another, So we could have this conversation.
We can always do that. Always another conversation we could have. But where do you want to take it? It sounds like you have some thoughts in mind, and you want to take it. So I'm very eager to hear that.
Let's hear where you were, because I kind of forget where we were.
I don't remember. We can reset. Where were we?
Bit of an ADHD moment here.
I'm trying to think. Again, you're also catching me after a day in the office plus evening patients, and it's like I give too much. We've covered a lot of ground. I'm realizing, like we've talked about like heteronormativity and kink, and
I guess maybe one last thing to talk about, or it's like, is there anything that you want to say in regards to or conversation around like mental health and like mental health practices that maybe men or gay men in general should be conscious of? Or I don't know, I know that's like a really broad topic, but I know that you had mentioned in your messages to me of wanting to talk about mental health, and I feel like we've tangentially have been there, but is there something directly that you want to say?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like, if you need help, please seek it out. And I think to that point, barriers to care and access to care is something I really care a lot about, because I meet so many people, I mean, gay men too, who are like, I don't know how to find a therapist. I don't know how to do this.
Yes.
And I don't know how to find one that takes my insurance. Everybody's like $1,000 an hour, or whatever it is. And to your point, like, how do I know I'm going to like this person? And I do like that there's an increasing movement to create websites and search engines that like can narrow down therapist by insurance, therapist by identity. And it actually lets you go like, I want a gay man, right? And it can like narrow it down right to that and be like, okay, and I want a gay man that takes like United Healthcare. Bam, we're going to narrow it down to that. So I care a lot about that. And I can definitely by the end of this like share like certain websites and how to look at them. So I care a lot about that. And I think, yeah, what I want to say is like, if you are in need of help, like please seek it out. The two websites I feel like everyone uses, one is like Common, which is Psychology Today. Like everybody looks on that website. And that's fine, it's a fine website. I'm a much bigger fan of another website, and this is a bit of self-promotion, so I apologize, but it's called Hello Alma, helloalma.com. And I really like them because it has the capabilities to search the way I was talking about, where you can just say like, I live in the state of New Jersey, Connecticut, Utah, whatever, and I want a licensed therapist who is a man. I want a licensed therapist who's a gay man. And they'll be like, well, and I wanted to take Aetna or whatever. And they'll say, here are the 12 people who fit that bill. There you go. And that
Mm.
narrows it down from when if you go to like Psychology Today and you're like, I want man, it's like, well, here's 20,000 hits.
Yes.
And some of those
Yeah.
pictures, by the way, are from like 1985.
Yes.
Another thing I like about that other website, Hello Alma, is you actually like the people on that website pay to be on there. So if they don't want to be on there, they stop paying and they get taken off, right? It's not like they forget.
I see.
And I say that like basically if you look me up, you know, I'm not on this, I'm not going to share my name, but basically if you go on Hello Alma and you look for gay therapists in the state of New York, I'll say that's an area that I'm located, you will see in my picture, oh, that guy's kink affirming. I'm not wearing like a harness or anything like that, but there may or may not be some leather in that photo, which was intended when I chose it to be like a wink, wink.
Yes.
You want to talk about things that, you know, most people don't feel comfortable about. We're going to do that. And so that's something I'm passionate about is really like knowing how to navigate those sites and also like knowing your healthcare and how it reimburses for mental health treatment, which is often terrible. And I always encourage people, like if their healthcare is like holding them up, like bug them, call them. I can't tell you how many times like I get rejected claims from my own therapist. Yes, I do see a therapist, and literally I will call them and be like, "Why'd you reject this?" And it's like, "No idea why we did that. Here's your payment back." And I'm like, "Why?
Yeah.
Why did you make me call?"
Arbitrary.
Pointless. Anyway, that's just like something.
What is your thought on I can't even think of the sites at the moment, but I'm sure that you know what I'm talking about. The very popular sites in which you can connect with a psychologist over your phone.
Like BetterHelp or Talkiatry or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, because I feel like they have great advertising, but I'm not quite sure if it's a really good product. I feel like I'm worried about the actual psychologists that work there, because I feel like from what I hear, they're like overworked and it's like really a lot.
Yeah, I have a blunt response, which is I don't like them. That's my first one. I definitely do not support text therapy. I don't, because think about like communicating with your, I don't know, your mother or like your friend. How much nuance gets lost in text and in an emoji? Right. I don't want to know how you're feeling through like smiley emojis. Like, you know, how often does like just seeing the period make you think, are you mad at me? Right? There's such a millennial thing. Like, are you mad at me? You used a period. Like, oh my God. And so, no. Because if someone texts me, I don't want to live anymore. I can't have a conversation over text to understand the data that would tell me whether they're truly at risk or not, or whether I need to be calling like for the ambulance to bring them to the ER.
Right.
I need to talk to you. I need to see you. If not in person, I need to see like your face, and I need to see even your arms, right? I work with some high-risk clients. I need to sometimes like check their arms and be like, did you cut again? So I don't like that aspect of it. And to your point about being overwhelmed, I mean, there was some, I think, New York Times article or maybe Washington Post about the therapists who work on these things. They talk about unwieldy caseloads, you know, a full caseload for a quality therapist. Like if you have a good therapist who's like independently practicing and they're good at their job, they're probably seeing anywhere from like 25 to 35 people a week, right? Because it's like your job, right? These caseloads were in like, I'm not kidding, like hundreds. Do you think that therapist knows anything about you and your life story and like what you need? And don't even get me started. And John Oliver did a thing on this. AI responses to texting for therapy. Did you see this?
I have not watched that, but I've heard of it.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I just remember like some kid that he, you know, and he does it in like a kind of dark humor way. Some kid was like, they tested it. It wasn't a real person. They tested it like, I want to kill myself. And it was like cry emoji or something really incipient, and I'm just like, oh, it didn't know what to do. Like it did not know how to navigate, or it was like telling the person like, just sleep. No, and like trying to give like those horrible positive, like toxic positivity things, like just sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a better day, and you can be the best you possible. Yeah, that's no.
I mean, you
not a thing.
Know that text, that information came from like all of those like 90s like Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen movies, and like You know? Like, you know, I feel like at least when I was growing up, most of the adults in my life did not want to talk about anything serious, and it was those responses were the responses I was given, um, you know, from all the adults
Yeah,
in my life. Like,
yeah, yeah.
this is life. It will get better, right? But you know, like I couldn't actually like, no one actually wanted to engage in the conversation.
But that's so alienating, right?
Yes.
Like, I'm not saying we dive into like every negative, depressive
Right.
thought, right? Like,
Right.
because I do think there's like, I have worked with clients who are, one of my biggest training growth areas was having a client come in and every week she was like, I did nothing this weekend. I'm depressed. Everything is terrible. And finally, one session, I was like, do something. Like, you need to like do something because of course you're depressed. You do nothing. And like, there's a whole area of behavioral activation, they call it, where it's basically like, you don't just lean into what they're saying. You actually like metaphorically kick them in the bum. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, to the point of like risk, like I can't trust an online therapist or a text therapist to
Right.
give any quality treatment. All you're going to get are coping skills. And you know
Yes.
what? Coping skills are pretty useless when they kind of just help you survive your structurally really problematic life
Right.
and difficult life. Um,
Yeah.
Another rant, if I
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
I don't know.
Okay. So we've we've been chatting now for an hour. Um, are there any like last minute thoughts or things that you want to share?
Um, I think to summarize some of the points that we've talked about, I'm going to try to do this at the end of the day with running on fumes of my brain, but help me with this.
Okay.
I think we should just summarize like the things we talked about, which is one, you know, kink is good and it is an avenue for almost a therapeutic experience of sex, creativity, positive connection, and
Mm-hmm.
health and happiness, to use a pretty basic word, but I think that's an important thing to say. And exploring how those things that make you kinky came to be can sometimes make those experiences even more wonderful and better.
Yes. Yes.
That's one thing. If you ever get a therapist that tells you you're messed up for your kinks, don't go to that therapist, please. You can find a better therapist. Um, I'll repeat, psychologytoday.com, good one. Hello Alma, even better one. You're going to find somebody who is more in line with what you're looking for. Don't feel
Mm-hmm.
ashamed to shop around for therapists also, by the way, right?
Totally.
And if you're like, I really want to see like a man who's black, and people are like, you don't need to find that, don't be too picky. Try to find it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you cannot, that's another story, right? And there's a whole
Mm-hmm.
story I could open up about like the shortage of like um, therapists of color and like the shortage that exists in the United States, especially in rural areas and places that aren't New York and Los Angeles. But if you know what you want in your therapist, try to find it. That said, try to stick it out a few sessions. If it's like a weird beginning, it might be the growing pains of getting to know one another. I do say that. If you shop around like constantly, you're never going to form a connection that's deep enough to actually share something painful or difficult. We talked about that. We talked about that. We talked about the parallel of kink play and the therapeutic relationship and opening up to somebody who holds, some power in the
Yes.
relationship.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about that a lot, but we did allude to it.
There, one thing that I wonder that like popped in my head, and I don't know if you want to go here,
Yeah.
is the relationship, I think you can speak to this more potentially,
Okay.
is the intersection of being like a psychologist
Okay.
and knowing how people work and perhaps being like a leather
I knew you were going
dom
to say
or a
that
master.
connection.
Like
Oh,
where do you want to talk about that?
no, it's just funny because when you say that, I just have this flash image in my brain of like every patient of mine on my caseload, like they're all flashing. And I'm just like, oh, like I'm their leather daddy? No. Um,
Or vice versa. I mean, does your psychology training ever like somehow creep up in conscious or unconscious ways that you later realize in your
yeah.
play? I can't hear you. Why can't I hear you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
My battery was like 20%, which is telling me like it's time to cook dinner soon.
Where were you?
You had asked about like the parallel between like the therapist and the patient,
Yes.
and then like the leather dom and like the other person, and we don't know what we necessarily call them, and the bridging of those two worlds. You know, I think there's a parallel in the dynamic that therapy is an agreed upon relation. It's an agreed upon power dynamic. You agree to enter in a space with another person for a set amount of time. You're going to pay the other person, right, to listen to things that you're going to share that are very painful and intimate, that you have maybe never told or shared with almost anyone else.
Yeah.
And you're trusting that they're going to keep all of that safe. We would use the word confidential or private, but like that it's going to keep you in a safe space, right? And that they are ultimately there to protect you. I think in any good kink relationship that would be a similar parallel dynamic you'd want. You don't want somebody actually harming you in a psychological way. And if it's physical, it's like, well, what are the boundaries of consent there? And like, what are we talking about? And is it actually physically safe? But like, it's a similar problem. Trust, I think, that takes time to build. And there are boundaries, right? You go to a therapist and you're like, I am not talking about something. And at the same time, a good therapist, you know, and this may be similar, different from kink, knows when to push boundaries and say like, look, like you never want to talk about this thing, and yet I'm pretty sure this thing that you really don't want to talk about is really playing a big role in what you're struggling with in your life. Can you walk with me down that path? I will promise to do my best to keep you safe. And to, you know, it's happened in sessions where I talk about sexual traumas, right? How do you walk with me in a 45-minute meeting into something very painful and feel like I am protecting you, especially if, you know, if I look like that person, if I'm the gender of that person, the sexual orientation of that person, like that's trust, and that's meaningful, and I don't take that lightly. And I said this in my dissertation acknowledgments. I said like something like, dissertation's over there, I'm not gonna get it, like, I am inspired by my patients who make me realize the resilience of the human spirit every day. You know? And I just heard the kid upstairs just like throw their toys
I
all
heard
over the
it,
room.
yes.
Did you hear that?
Yes.
That parent is probably pissed. Anyway, does that make sense? Just about like, the way I see that? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's thank you for sharing that and entertaining that question.
Yeah. I could tell you wanted to ask it, so I wanted to leave the door open to it.
Well, I figured it's a good way to kind of close out that. And yeah, I mean, is there anything else that you want to share? Either like thoughts about, you know, any other like random thoughts or anything about yourself?
You know me. I think we've met in the real world, and so I'm notoriously like a type person and a private person, and especially given the professional role I have and the work I do that's not related to my private practice, I am, you know, and you know, like keeping my own self a little bit more nebulous.
That's totally your
I think suffice to say that like there are, you know, I've shared a little bit of the kinks that I have. Obviously, like if you're listening, you can't see this, like I'm wearing a leather shirt, like I identify definitely as a part of this community, and there are ways in which I engage in it differently than others, and unique to my experience. There are other things that I haven't shared about my sexuality in here, about my romantic partnerships, or just like the way I relate to others in that sense. And I purposely like don't want to share those things. I think it's important if somebody were to ever come to me through this avenue and say, I want you as a therapist, you know, it's better that they not know those things, at least at the beginning, because, you know, that's actually, I always say to people, it's data. It's data if you come to me and say like, are you married? Do you have kids? Do you yada yada? I will usually tell people, unless I'm like fearful for my safety, like, you know, I'll tell them, yeah, no, blah, blah, blah. But I always say, well, I'll tell you, but I also want to know why that's important to you, right? So it's important for me at the beginning to not have those things known, because then what you ask about tells me your values often,
Yes.
or at least what you value in this relationship, possibly.
Yeah.
Right? If I say yes or no, what does it mean to say yes or no to that question?
That's interesting.
Yeah. You know, this account that I made was pretty much like for this interview, and I don't know how much I'm going to maintain it. It's not monitored. Please don't anybody text it for any mental health concerns. Call 988 or 911 for the United States. Those are the mental health crisis hotline, and then obviously 911 is 911. So no, do not text or message me or DM me. I will not see it. It is not monitored. I feel like HIPAA is listening,
Good.
so I need to like say
Good.
that.
Yes.
So that's just something I really wanted to say. I don't know. I'm very bad at talking about myself. So is there anything there that you want to ask me? You can be direct. I can always say no, but like.
No, I think you've done a really good job of like setting your boundaries of what you want to share, and yeah.
And anyone listening can look me up. I probably won't let you follow this like account, frankly. Just that's not gonna be appropriate. But again, I told you about that site, Hello Alma, and if you look for the gay therapists in New York, gay psychologists in New York, there aren't many of us. You're gonna guess pretty quickly which picture is mine. Just saying. But that's what I would say to all of that. Okay. It was lovely chatting with you again. Yeah. It's been a while, I think.
Yeah, it's been a while. I don't have any plans to go to New York, where you live, coming up anyway. It's been almost a year, but it's so expensive.
I know.
So that's life. But yeah, I really enjoyed you, being part of this and kind of sharing your knowledge. And
well, thank you for having me. It was a long time coming, because I think we tried to do it once and I was like, yes. I am overwhelmed at work. I cannot.
And you've had a lot of things going on, so I totally understand that. Like,
yeah, I was trying to get a tenure promotion in the academic medical system, which is its own nightmare of its own process. And I was just like, I remember, I think I said to you, I was like, I don't want to jeopardize that if someone were to find this. And then luckily, like, I switched to pays me and it's not connected to the academic, but I'm still in the academic system. I'm like, great, that liberates me. Huzzah! I don't know.
So let me ask you this. So typically, after this, I will download the audio and kind of do some minimal editing out and put that on Spotify. So you're okay with that?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's where it will be housed, because I feel like some of the I feel like this is a useful conversation, and if it gets people kind of thinking about things and kind of opening up doors, I feel like that's kind of the purpose here, is that just to kind of introduce people to concepts or ideas or things like that. So
I hope it was enlightening, at least for anyone who listened to it or came and saw and left, came back, whatever. I care a lot about mental health broadly, especially for the queer gay community, and like especially like for anybody in the gay community. Like, there is hope out there, and I hope you can find it and connect with providers who affirm who you are. You deserve that. You deserve no less. And to be seen fully for all the complexities that you bring, including the unique and quirky sexuality that makes you the most special you on the planet, to get a little corny. You should have that in your treatment.
I really appreciate that. So, and I'm sure other listeners, would be very appreciative to have a therapist that really affirms them as well. So
yeah, I hope so.
Well, again, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and I look forward to our next conversation.
I will always look forward to it. If you come here, or if I'm passing through your town, I'll let you know. There are reasons to go in that direction, so I will let you know.
Well, let me know, and
All right. Thank you so much.
Yes.
My phone is ready to say, how are you still going after all this time? So I'm going to turn it off. Okay. But thank you so much, and have a great evening, and thanks everyone who listened.
You too. Have a good evening, and see you around.
Bye.
Bye.